Hi everyone, welcome to part 2 of the Female Athlete webinar series. Just to get started, few house rules again this week. So hands up function is not in use. Any questions, if you can put those in the Q&A box. Remember just to keep them general and anonymous, just because it can still be quite a sensitive subject when talking about the menstrual cycle. We will aim to answer as many questions as we can at the end, but we'll also put our emails on. You'll be able to see those on the last slide. So if there's anything that we don't get around to answering, then please get in touch using our email addresses and you'll be able to, and we'll hopefully be able to answer your questions. Any technical issues, please use the chat function. We'll try and get those sorted. And then finally, today we are hoping to use a couple of polls to try and add a bit more of an interaction to this session. So hopefully they'll work. If you're not able to engage with that, we will share all of the results as we go through the presentation. So again, hopefully you'll at least be able to see some of the results from that. Perfect. So I think that's everything from a house rules perspective. So welcome to part 2. And welcome back to everyone that joined us last week. Today we're going to focus more on the menstrual cycle and how it impacts training and performance. Before I get started, I'll just introduce myself. I'm Natalie Brown. I am a research scientist with a collaboration called the Welsh Institute of Performance Science, and that's a collaboration between Sport Wales and Swansea University. And my main area of research is around the female athlete, focusing on the menstrual cycle. Ness, if I pass over to you, I'll let you introduce yourself before we get started.
Yeah, I'm Vanessa Davis. I'm a physiologist and I'm based at Sport Wales. And one of my main sports I work with is athletics, so mainly with the endurance side of athletics as well.
Perfect, thanks Ness. So just to either recap from last week or introduce to anyone new joining us today, the female athlete projects that I'm working on, I started off by speaking to female athletes, Welsh female athletes, to understand their perceptions and their experiences of the menstrual cycle in relation to training and competition. And that's really been the insight and what has allowed us to drive forward the areas that we're working on and we're providing support on. So last week we very much focused around menstrual health, and this week we're going to focus more on the impact of training and performance, touching on some of the symptoms as well and how that might interlink. So today's aims, first of all, I want to highlight really that these webinars, from my perspective anyway, are just a starting point. So there is so much information or knowledge that and experiences that I'd like to share, but we've obviously got quite a short amount of time. So this is really just a starting point for me, a starting point for the conversations and potentially where the work supporting a female athlete can go from here. So the aims of today are considering the impacts of the menstrual cycle for training, exploring a little bit how the menstrual cycle may impact competitive performance, and finally going on to conversations about the menstrual cycle. So maybe some considerations for female athletes, coaches, and also parents when having conversations relating to the menstrual cycle. Okay, Ness, shall I pass over to you?
Yeah. So before we do move on to this slide, which many of you will see is a bit of a recap on what we did last week, we're going to attempt to do a poll. So let me just see if this works. So launch. So hopefully now you should be able to see a poll. So it's just the one question to start with. So what would be classed as irregular for a menstrual cycle? So this is what we discussed in the first webinar. So it would be good if everybody could have a go at voting on that. We'll just give you a couple of minutes. Okay, so I can see that 63% of you have voted. Oh, it's still going up. Okay, I think we're not getting any more votes coming in now. So I'll just close that poll and then hopefully we'll be able to share the responses with you. Can you see those now?
No, I don't think they've come up. Hamlet, let me share the results. There we go.
Oh, there we go.
Hopefully you're able to see that poll now and see how everyone answered. Ness, shall I let you go through that one first?
Yeah. So as you can see, you can see all the results there. So actually, all of those symptoms there are a sign of an irregular cycle. So is there anything you want to add to that, Nat?
Yeah, I think it's just highlighting that the most commonly voted there at 67% was the variation in the length of the cycle. But actually, when we're also talking about irregular cycles, that does include excessive pain, heavy bleeding, and also no periods for 3 months. So that is seen as irregular. And all of those factors were areas that we discussed last week, and should be seen as considerations when working with female athletes that might influence not just performance, but also health and well-being of the individual. Okay,
And then hang on a second.
There you go.
I'm not sure how to do the next one. Oh, there we go. I think I've got it.
Amazing.
Okay, hang on a second. Technical issues. Okay, so this is just the next question. So which of these can cause a loss of your period? So again, just give you a bit of time to vote. Okay, still got some votes coming in. A few more, last couple are coming through now. All right, I think that might be those. So I'll try and, oh, we've got a couple of last ones. Can you tell I've not done this bit before? Okay, so I shall close that and then I'll share those results as well. Okay, so as you can see from those three, quite high scores for all of them. And again, yeah, all three of those can cause a loss of your period. And again, I think we discussed those quite a lot last week in the first webinar, but it also just shows the impact that not only training can have on you, have on your cycle, but also any psychological stress as well. So all these things are to consider when working with your athletes.
Definitely, and also just to add, Ness, just the effect of potentially, I mentioned this last week, of the current situation we're in, and it can be quite stressful for quite a lot of people. It's quite unknown. We don't know what's changing, what's happening next. We've not got much control over the situation, and that can cause quite a lot of stress. So we've actually been finding a lot of females, there's been kind of reporting either increased symptoms or periods have become more irregular, and that can be very much linked to that psychological stress that people are currently experiencing.
Cool. Thanks for that, Nat. Right, I'm going to try and hide this now. So there, they're just the two questions for now, but we will add another one throughout the presentation. So just to go back to this slide, and just to kind of recap a little bit on last week. So towards the end of the last webinar, we spoke around REDS, so which is relative energy deficiency in sport, and we looked at how it can influence, both health and performance. So the two infographics that we've got up here. So on my left, as I'm looking at it, you've got it shows the effect on the athlete's health. So all sorts of areas. So for example, bone health, menstrual function, cardiovascular, psychological, and then the effects then also on the athlete's performance. And then on the other side, the other infographic, we've got a graph that shows progression of a REDS athlete and an athlete that's in energy balance. And I think one of the things that we highlighted last week was that very often, initially, you can see improvements in performance. And so it is seen as a positive thing, but actually it isn't sustainable having that energy deficit. And long term, it's that the energy balanced athlete that has those big improvements in performance. So today we're going to focus more on performance, and not just from an energy deficit perspective, but we're also going to look at athletes' experiences who experience normal cycles. And I think before we kind of move forward, it's just important to highlight that at the moment, there is a lack of research out there into kind of female athletes and performance, and research that has been done, the findings have been slightly contradictory as well. So just to kind of bear that in mind when we're discussing things. Okay, so on to the next slide. So the first thing that we wanted to share with you was a bit of a case study around the REDS. So Bobby Clay is an endurance runner, and if anybody wants to look up her story, the information that I've got here it can be found in Athletics Weekly. So if you Googled Athletics Weekly and Bobby Clay, you would find this story. So these are in her own words. So she was 20 years old and she'd never had a period. She's diagnosed with osteoporosis. She was the girl who overtrained, the girl who underfueled, but always thought that it won't happen to me. So that's kind of in her own words. So if we go on to the next slide, and we can look at her story in a little bit more detail. So at the age of 15, she got into the GB team and competed at her first World Cross Country Championships. And in training, everything was going really well. She was reaching all the targets that had been set for her, and she was sort of really achieving. So as we've highlighted before in the past, early signs can show that there are those improvements in performance. She was pleased with the way everything was going, but really wanted to push on and just get better. Her coach, however, disagreed and said that we should keep things as they are. We shouldn't sort of move things forward anymore. But she wanted to move on and wanted to progress more and wanted to train harder. So she ended up moving training groups. So she went to a training group that was a bit more track based and was a lot more intense for her. As a consequence, she began underfueling, and she started to force her body into overtraining. But again, she was saying that she was still meeting all these training targets. So her, in her mind, her body wasn't showing her any signs that she couldn't cope with this, and she wasn't making progress. Apart from the one big red flag that we've been talking about, and the fact that she wasn't having a menstrual cycle. But in her point of view, she saw this as a positive. She was like, well, I don't have to worry about it. It's not going to interfere with training. It's not going to interfere with competition. So actually, she saw it as an advantage and as a benefit. Her parents, on the other hand, were worried and saw that it was a concern. So took her to her GP, who did do some blood tests. So these came back saying that her hormone levels were low, but she was probably a late developer, so it was fine and not to really worry about it. So next, she actually was swimming and managed to break her foot, which is quite a hard thing to do, to break your foot while you're swimming. And it was on the back of this then that she was diagnosed with osteoporosis. And over the last year, she's only been fracture free for 4 weeks. So it just shows that the impact that this RED can have, and that underfueling and not getting that energy balance right. Okay, next slide now.
Perfect, thanks Ness. I think it just really kind of does highlight through that story just that we talked about last week, the vital sign of having a menstrual cycle that females have. And actually, if they're irregular or those periods stop, it's a really good sign just to give that first indication that an energy balance is maybe not quite right, and something to consider if training's too hard or underfueling, whether intentionally or unintentionally. So just moving on to touching a little bit more on the menstrual cycle in training and performance. So I showed you this graph last week, and just to recap really, first of all, you've got the red area, which is the period. So that's associated with the time when a female's bleeding. You've then, within the menstrual cycle, then it can be divided into the follicular phase and the luteal phase, which is divided in the middle by ovulation. And I say in the middle that it has always, and still in the research, says that ovulation is midway through the cycle. Now that can actually vary days before or after that. So it doesn't always happen absolutely in the middle of the cycle. Likewise, although this graph says 28 days, that can be 33 days for one female or 26 days for another female. So it does vary. But within the kind of literature and research, it's still kind of perceived as being this 28-day cycle, ovulation day 14. And within the follicular and luteal phase, they're characterized by fluctuating hormones. So the follicular phase is associated with this increase in estrogen, which is the blue line, which peaks prior to ovulation. And then within the luteal phase, that's considered the high hormone phase, when you've got an elevation in progesterone, but also still a slight elevation there in estrogen. So how is that considered in relation to potentially training and performance? And I think one thing I want to highlight before I go into that is this is a biological process designed for reproduction, and it is something that the menstrual cycle is influenced by behavior, but likewise behavior can also influence the menstrual cycle. So just keep that, something I just want to keep in mind, that last week we very much touched on how training can influence the menstrual cycle, whereas this week we're flipping it around as to how the menstrual cycle might interact with training. So to go through how some of these symptoms might influence, that are associated with the menstrual cycle, might influence training and performance. First of all, the period, alongside the physical blood loss, there's also associated with stomach cramps and GI disturbance. So actually, when we think about training and competition, how might that interact? So around competition, it is quite normal to have a GI disturbance anyway, from being quite stressed. Adding the mix of the menstrual cycle, that could be something that's maybe a distraction or a concern for female athletes around competition. And then stomach cramps. Some females have quite mild stomach cramps, others have really severe stomach cramps. How would that influence being able to actually perform either competitively or within training? So if we move on then into the follicular phase, so that's associated with what we'd call a feel-good hormone. So estrogen is kind of known to increase energy, which can help with motivation to train, feel really ready, really up for training and trying really hard. You've also got a better recovery during that time. So you can try hard and recover slightly better around the follicular phase. There's also the association there with kind of favouring of glucose or glycogen use as the fuel for exercise. So that might maybe favour the more high intensity type exercise to be completed. But within this phase, there's also an increased risk of injury. That's associated with the increase in estrogen. So within connective tissues, such as your tendons and ligaments, you have estrogen receptors. And when you've got the increase in estrogen within that follicular phase, that can increase the laxity of those connective tissues, which can cause an increased risk of injury. A lot of that research has been done so far within football. So things like ACL injury as a result of change in direction at speed, but it might be something to consider as well within athletics, if I'm thinking about hurdles or any sort of jumping activity, the effect of having that joint laxity on that. So that's a consideration for training and maybe what sorts of training you're doing around that time. I will highlight now that it's not the whole phase that that's affected by. So it's not literally from the start of the period to ovulation. It's actually a few days around that really high peak in estrogen that can be affected. And then also associated with this phase of the menstrual cycle is a decreased risk of illness. And when I'm talking about illness, I'm more specifically around upper respiratory tract infections. So if I then move on to the luteal phase. So the mid-luteal phase is when progesterone starts to increase, and you actually start getting a shift from that glycogen use for exercise more to fat as fuel, basically. So there is the potential that you may have better endurance capabilities during that time. But also associated with that is you do have kind of less risk taking. So females can start feeling more anxious and not take as much risk, maybe perceive it more as a threat rather than a challenge. Increase in body temperature, that's associated with the increase in progesterone. And then also that's when you can start having feelings of bloating and also constipation for some females. And lastly, highlighting their poor coordination. So again, what does that mean in training if you've got poor coordination? Again, if we think about types of training that you're doing, or if an athlete, again, let's go back to hurdles as an example, knocks over multiple hurdles, actually, is that because part of the phase they are in their menstrual cycle that's influencing that? That might be something really to consider, especially if it's going into competition. And the frustration that might cause and how you maybe manage that could be quite important. And then going on to the late luteal phase, and this is where hormones start declining and can cause a real broad range of both physical and emotional symptoms. And linking to that point I made there around managing frustrations and maybe managing that emotional response, that could be something that is quite important to manage both in training and in competition. So when I was talking to female athletes, there was sometimes the kind of awareness there that they were really frustrated. Last week they could lift a certain weight or jump a certain distance or run a certain speed, but all of a sudden that's not happening, and a lot of frustration, and they've not sometimes associated with it. Actually, it's linked with the menstrual cycle. There is a reason why they're feeling like that, and to be able to recognize and have that self-awareness can really help with the management of those emotional responses. And also within that phase, flip side of that follicular phase is you can get an increased risk of upper respiratory tract infections. So generally females might say they're feeling a bit more like they've got a cold coming on, those sorts of symptoms, and that can be associated with the effect of the menstrual cycle on the immune system. I've put there at the bottom, and I think probably that's one area I really want to highlight, is that information I've just given you, and Ness highlighted at the start, is quite generic, and also research is varying in the research is to whether you can do strength training better at a certain time or endurance training better at a certain time. And actually, for me at the moment, the key thing is the individual and the fact that every female will respond and have different symptoms to the menstrual cycle. It's actually considering how those experiences interact with training and performance, and thinking about what the coping or the management strategies might be in order to be able to manage that and perform at their best. So I'm just going to go into a little bit more detail on a couple of areas that I haven't maybe touched on when I talk about it in relation to the graph and what different symptoms are experienced at different times of how the menstrual cycle can also influence performance. So that first one there, progesterone increases catabolism. So what I mean by that is you potentially have an increased breakdown of muscle at around the time when you have a higher level of progesterone, so that late luteal phase. Consideration there for training performance: are you making sure you've got the correct nutrition to maintain that muscle building response that you want from training? Sleep latency is affected, which is the time it takes to get to sleep, which can also really affect that kind of readiness or the recovery. Alongside the poor coordination I mentioned, you've also got the learning and processing. So that can also be influenced by the high levels of progesterone at a time when maybe learning new skills might not be the best time. Only a few days of the month are we talking here, but it might be aware that you've got some days females are really frustrated. Why can't they pick up a new skill? Why are they not learning it? It might be related to the menstrual cycle. Recovery linked again, it is different at different stages of the cycle. So a female might be able to recover really quickly within their follicular phase, but you might have some females that experience a lot slower recovery between sessions towards the end of their cycle and before their period. And then finally, I've touched on that estrogen interaction with connective tissues and just how that might affect the biomechanics and injury risk. So just thinking about different movements, different types of training that you might do, and how some of these aspects related to the menstrual cycle might influence that training performance. And I suppose it's kind of so where are we at now? We've not got loads of evidence and loads of research within female athletes that we can definitely say you need to do this training at this time, this training at another time within their menstrual cycle, especially when we consider between youth and senior female athletes. But it's actually something that we need to investigate more. I won't even go into detail of all of the plans of things and areas that I want to research, otherwise we'll be here for way more than an hour. But it's also a consideration to actually how can we really start to understand female athletes that we coach, or female athletes understanding themselves. So they've got that self-awareness of how those symptoms might present in themselves and how that might interact with training. So is that a female is more clumsy or has an increased emotional response? And actually at this stage, rather than going away and thinking about how we can completely replan a training phase and training cycles, what other factors could be considered alongside this that might be able to relieve some of those symptoms? So is that nutrition? Is that sleep? Is that recovery? And Ness is going to touch on a lot more around management strategies later on. So I won't go off on a tangent and talk about those. Ness, I'll pass over to you before I go off on before I keep going, otherwise I'll never stop and we've only got an hour.
Thanks, Nat. Okay, so we're going to look a little bit more at symptoms now. So we did sort of explore this a little bit in the first webinar. And we've mentioned a few times around these interviews that Nat has done, and they have provided us with so much useful information. And as you can see on the right-hand side as I'm looking at the screen, there is a list of symptoms there. And these are symptoms that Welsh athletes reported experiencing themselves. As you can see, there is a lot of them, and they vary from sort of, pain and cramps and heavy bleeding to weight gain, that clumsiness. And then also some kind of sort of psychological ones. So there's the increases in worry and anxiety. People are getting emotional and moody and agitated. So there's a huge variety of symptoms that can be experienced. And I think, and one of the things that we keep saying and keep repeating is that everybody is individual, and you probably won't get two athletes that have the same symptoms, and also the severity of the symptoms as well. Somebody might get a few kind of stomach cramps, but they can just carry on, whereas other people might just have really, really, really bad, pain and stomach cramps and can't get out of bed for a couple of days. So it's just really getting to understand your athlete and the symptoms that they're experiencing, and how you can help them to sort of manage those. So we'll have a look now at how some of these symptoms can actually impact on performance. So if we go on to the next slide. So I'm not sure if any of you would have seen this around Jasmine Sawyer. It was a couple of years ago now. So she was actually forced to pull out of a competition. She's a long jumper. And a couple of days after the competition, she decided to post on Twitter. And I've just copied and pasted what it was that she has posted on Twitter, which I'll read through to you now. So I wasn't going to give an explanation online about why I pulled out of yesterday's competition, but this is something that isn't talked about enough in sport and ought to be. About an hour before I was supposed to leave for the track, I came on my period. I get very bad periods for the first 1 to 2 days. Can't walk, intense pain radiating down my legs, head spinning, full body sweating, shouting, crying kind of bad. 5 minutes before leaving for the track, all of the above happened. If you don't have periods or you don't have them bad, it's hard to imagine why I can't suck it up and compete. But when you're in so much pain that you can't walk more than a few steps and your legs buckle under your own weight, there's no chance that you can jump. So I think it's really important that, these high profile athletes start to share this information and sort of make people aware that they do suffer with it as well. And I think the bit that stands out for me in what Jasmine has said is that if you don't have periods or you don't have them bad, it's hard to imagine why you can't just suck it up and compete. And I think, in athletics and in sport, a lot of coaches are male. So they don't have that, they don't experience the periods and the symptoms that come with it. So it is hard for them to imagine what you're going through. But also I have heard of some females who because they don't experience bad periods themselves and don't have any problems, they're just like, well, no, you just get on and just carry on. So it's really, really important to take that time to understand your athlete and understand what they're experiencing and help put some strategies and management, strategies in place to help them manage these symptoms that they're getting, so that they are able to compete and train all the time.
Perfect. Thanks for that example, Ness. I think that's kind of highlights one of the key areas. And I'm going to actually, before I go on, I asked the athletes that I interviewed a similar question that I'm just going to put up as a poll now, hopefully. So according to recent research in elite female athletes, what percentage of athletes experience negative symptoms? Select one of the following. I quite like doing these polls, Ness. Okay, a couple more votes coming in. I was about to jump ahead and I was like, oh no, we've got a few more votes coming in. Okay, so if I close that and share the results. So yes, the 63% of you that said 75% of female athletes experience negative symptoms is correct. So when I actually interviewed the female athletes, 75% of them actually said they experienced negative symptoms, especially severe stomach cramps. So I really just wanted to highlight that to you, because when I was, when I was collecting those results and that came back, I was actually quite shocked at how high and how many females experience negative symptoms. And that's really kind of driven me to continue and look more in support this area. I thought it was something that was worth sharing for you to also be aware of, that actually a large portion of the athletes that you coach might actually be experiencing negative symptoms. And again, that might not necessarily be stomach cramps. That might also be kind of more emotional symptoms that they're experiencing that is affecting their training and performance. So just to go back to our presentation, I've just put that there just to refresh the impact of the menstrual cycle on training and competition performance. That actually it can affect so many different physiological functions. And is a determinant of performance that should be considered alongside any of these that would be discussed within coaches and athletes' impact on training and performance. So I think it's really important to consider that actually, how do we get to the point when the menstrual cycle is just considered another determinant of performance, and we equally discuss that alongside anything else that might impact? And just to highlight there, really, you've got the menstrual cycle. It can affect so many functions, so brain function, respiratory, metabolic, thermoregulation. You get an increase in temperature when you get a rise in progesterone, but it can also affect the injury rate and illness. So there's definitely aspects of the menstrual cycle that can influence potentially the amount of days you miss from training because of illness, or it's an area that you can look at to prevent injury, which if we've not got athletes that are able to train because they're ill or injured, then straight away that's affecting performance before even looking at how we might plan a training, might design a training plan in relation to the menstrual cycle. So I've got there 66% of athletes report training as worse at some point of their menstrual cycle. And as we've just been through, 75% actually experience abdominal cramps, causing them to either adjust or miss training. But on the flip side of that, I don't want this to always be seen that actually the menstrual cycle has a negative impact on performance, and always see the negative side of things, because actually Olympic medal winning performance have taken place during all phases of the menstrual cycle. And I'm actually going to pass over to Ness to give you an example of one of those examples that have been within the media.
Yeah, so as you said, we have given a couple of case studies and examples at the moment, and we were conscious that things were coming across as being a bit negative. So just want to share with you that Paula Radcliffe actually revealed that the first time she broke the marathon world record, which was in Chicago in 2002, she actually started to suffer with period cramps in the last third of the race. But still she was able to push through and break that world record. So it's about kind of having those strategies in place and being able to manage some of these symptoms to help you still perform.
Thanks, Ness. And to bring that to life even more, I'm not going to talk through all of these, but these were some of the quotes from athletes that I interviewed, so Welsh athletes that we're working with, of what their experiences of the menstrual cycle are like. When I asked them, how does it impact their training or performance, or what is their experience of their menstrual cycle? And there's so many on there, but hopefully it just highlights a little bit. First day is always pretty grim. I just feel terrible. I feel a bit lousy, but once it comes, so when they're saying it and they're talking to their period, it's absolutely fine. It's annoying and inconvenient. I silently suffer. I just deal with it. It's no one else's problem. I manage it anyway. The time before my period impacts my training performance, but once I'm on, it's just the inconvenience of bleeding. And that one there, my periods were definitely worse when I was a teenager. So that was something we discussed last week as well. So they're just a couple that I wanted to bring up and share with you of females' experiences, rather than me kind of sitting here and telling you how those symptoms from a scientific perspective might be affecting performance and training. I thought the voice of some female athletes really helps describe that and gives a picture of how it might be impacting training performance and maybe what you do need to consider when coaching those females. So Ness, I'll pass back to you to give another example within youth athletes.
Yeah, so we just wanted to share an example to help people to kind of think about how the menstrual cycle impacts on young athletes. So we spoke a bit last week around kind of irregular periods, the irregular cycles and the symptoms, and just how it's quite a big change and not a very pleasant experience to start with, and as you get to understand your body and the changes it's going through. So this is an example that we've had through from a Welsh athlete who's happy for us to share it with you. So this athlete, they started their periods around the age of 13, so normal development there, and they had regular periods, so that's really good. But then she had one particular experience when she competed as an under 20 athlete, and her period started the night before she was due to compete. But due to having really bad period pain, she didn't sleep very well. So subsequently the next day, so when she had to race, her distance was 800 meters, she had a really poor race and underperformed compared to what she was expected to do. But this is the bit that's really important, I feel, is that she said that it created a huge dent to her confidence, and to be honest, that she was unable to move on from this. She was 18 at the time and felt that she'd let a lot of people down. So subsequently, she had one more year in the sport and then stopped competing for around 10 years. And there's a lot of work out there and a push to try and keep female athletes engaged in sport, because there is a big dropout of females, particularly around the teenage years. And, with going through puberty, changes in the body and the menstrual cycle. So, if we can help athletes and talk openly about this and show them that it's okay and they can still compete, and there's ways that we can deal and manage it, hopefully in the future we can stop examples like this happening, and we can maintain that talent and keep athletes within the sport. So if we move on to the next slide. So we've spoken a little bit throughout this presentation. We keep talking about having strategies in place and helping athletes to sort of get these in place. So the idea around this is we want to help female athletes to perform at their best on any day of their cycle. Athletes can't, competitions are going to be put on set dates, and they're not going to be able to move them because it's not going to be the right time for their cycle. The Olympic final, and they are going to have to compete and sort of deal with that. So there's a few areas here of strategies that can be kind of put in place that can help athletes. So we've spoken a little bit throughout around diet and and nutrition. So having a healthy, balanced diet, sort of containing lots of fruit and vegetables, and kind of avoiding processed foods, that is said to help with the menstrual cycle and symptoms. And I think Nat's going to share a bit of information with you later that there is going to be a nutrition webinar, not specific around the female athlete, but it could help provide information around the strategies to help. Also managing training and life stress. So again, we've shown that how psychological stress can impact on the menstrual cycle, and also that the training stress as well. So if you're overtraining and not getting that energy balance right, so managing that is key. Sleep and recovery. So Nat's mentioned earlier that there's certain phases within the cycle where you can recover, you can recover a bit better, or there are certain times when it might be a bit harder for you to recover. So getting any of those strategies in place, and sleep as well. So if you're struggling to sleep at certain times of the cycle, so sometimes in the luteal phase, when you have that increase in body temperature, people can find that that can affect their sleep. So can you make sure that, the room is a bit cooler, you need a fan, or, the bedding that you're using. So just little strategies that can be put in place that could all help. And I think one of the big things and the key to this is actually getting athletes and encouraging athletes to start monitoring and tracking their cycles. And the reason for this is just to help them to understand and plan, so that they're becoming a bit more self-aware about themselves and their bodies and how they react to their menstrual cycle. So if they, if they're monitoring and they know that a couple of days before their period they have they're really low in motivation, that's something that they can talk to their coach about and help put strategies in place to help them get through that training. So I think having that monitoring and the tracking is really key, and there's various apps available that you can do that with. Also, if somebody suffers from quite a lot of period pain, light exercise is actually said to be quite beneficial. So for example, yoga. So again, if training does need to be altered because they are in so much pain, perhaps putting in that yoga, which can help with recovery, is a strategy that can be used. And also the use of heat. So for example, hot water bottles can be quite good as well, but also looking at if any painkillers are needed and that kind of thing as well. Some athletes experience kind of quite tenderness in their breast during the menstrual cycle, and a key to this is actually having a really good sports bra that is fitted well. Very often, I think we all go and get measured for a normal bra, but we kind of forget about a sports bra, and actually that can make a massive difference. So that's another thing that can be looked at. And just a little example at the bottom here around that monitoring. So through the interviews that Nat had done, so an athlete had stopped taking the contraceptive pill, and because of this, she wasn't sure when her cycles were going to happen and how regular they were going to be. And she was a weightlifter, so obviously it was very important for her to gain an understanding of this. So she started to monitor her cycle, and she found it particularly useful because with a weight making sport, she was prone to kind of being slightly heavier at certain times of the month. So she found it actually really useful to know when this was going to be and help to put those strategies in place to support that. Okay, now.
So yeah, perfect. Thanks, Ness. I'm aware of the time, so I'll try and wrap this up a little bit quicker. I went off on a tangent, didn't I? And it's gone over now. So I think this is one of the key things for me of where we're currently at, is trying to bring the menstrual cycle, menstruation into the open, so it is a conversation that's held between coaches and athletes and between females. And by bringing that into the open, we're also letting others know that it's okay to discuss. So trying to maybe change some of those perceptions that it's something that's secret, it's something that should be hidden or just dealt with. But it's actually something that we can talk about openly, consider it as a performance determinant, and look at management strategies so that training and performance can be optimal. And I've put there properly naming it and talking about about menstruation without using euphemisms. And this, for me personally, is really important, because as soon as we use any words other than periods or menstrual cycle, we're reinforcing the message that it's still secret, we're still not comfortable, we're still not happy talking about that. So just try and be really comfortable and confident talking about the menstrual cycle or periods. And the more you do it, the more comfortable you get. I mean, as I said, this is the area that I research, so it's mainly the only area I do ever talk around now. So I'm super comfortable talking about it. But the more you do, it does become easier. And also athletes will then become more open to talking around their menstrual cycle. It's really important to know your athlete, and also for your athlete to have their own self-awareness of their menstrual cycle. And that can really help create observations and awareness of experiences to manage training and performance, and also to initiate conversations. And just to bring that to life a little bit as to why conversations are key. So we might all be sat there thinking, well, actually, I'm more than happy talking about the menstrual cycle. But actually, these are some of the perceptions of female athletes that I spoke to. And it's great seeing one saying, if it was affecting me, if it was affecting my performance, I'd openly talk about it. But on the flip side of that, there's still females that say, no, I don't think I'd ever have that conversation. Or if I'm on there's something about telling your male coach, I'm on my period, if you cannot tell as many people as possible, you try not to. And if they're really awkward and then that makes you feel more awkward, or you just don't want to make them feel uncomfortable. And then finally, I thought this was really interesting and kind of really hit home for me that it's crazy. We've had loads of workshops about diet and nutrition and psychology, S&C, stretching, meetings with physios, but something that happens every month that you can't control, there's nothing. So just highlighting that maybe we need to provide more support to female athletes about the menstrual cycle, but also provide them with opportunities to talk about it and consider how it might influence their training and performance. And how can we do that? So how could we maybe help start the conversation if we're a little bit unsure? I've just put some steps there. And again, there's different approaches, but this is just kind of one way that I'd approach it, is really to, first of all, seek clarity. So what is the message? What is your observation? Or as an athlete, what's your experience that you're looking to share? And make sure you've got a really clear message that you want to share when you're talking about the menstrual cycle. Follow on from that, the evidence. So actually, if you're a coach speaking to the female athlete, share the facts and knowledge that you've observed. So that might be, I've really noticed you get quite clumsy a couple of days before you're due on your period, and it's really consistent every month. And follow that up with actually, what effect might that be having right now, but also long term, how can we change that, or what can we do different? It's really important to listen. So listen to the athlete's experience, and likewise for the athlete to listen to the coach, to then think about how you could action some of those conversations that you've just had. So it's one thing talking about it, but actually, what can you do to make a change? What can you do differently? What can you do to help that individual? And then finally, support. What next? So when I say support, that means maybe supporting the female athlete, but also as a coach, do you need any additional support? So who could you collaborate with? Who could you ask advice with? How as a team could you help with that athlete? And I've put at the bottom there 3 barriers preventing conversation, not just relating to the menstrual cycle, but all different conversations. And they can be linked to confidence, knowledge, and time. So are there any of those aspects relating to conversations with the menstrual cycle that have stopped you previously having that conversation? Is that the confidence? Is that the knowledge? Or is that making time for it? Okay, I think this just reiterates some of what I've just discussed, but the last point there is really important around it can be challenging to have these conversations, but it's definitely preferable than ignoring it. There's no 2 conversations that will be the same. That's because all females are different as people, but also their experiences of their menstrual cycle will be different. But it's really important to engage and support conversations and trying to change those perceptions of awkwardness. So just some considerations: change that perception of awkwardness. Make sure that you're comfortable, you're confident talking about the menstrual cycle. And to help with that can also be trust and comfort of building a relationship and open communication. And with that point, it's also worth considering, is there someone else that you know has a better relationship currently with the athlete that they might feel more comfortable talking to about their menstrual cycle, to at least initiate that conversation? And support them as an individual athlete. So person first, we keep calling them athletes, and I keep calling you coaches and athletes, but we are actually all people, and try and remember that you know, the importance of having those open conversations. But definitely when you speak to females, especially potentially younger females, prepare for them feeling reports of it's an off-topic conversation, so it's personal, it's perceived as something that's secret, so they maybe don't want to share that, and maybe therefore not having an initial positive response. But keep looking at different ways of approaching it, or sharing your observations, or thinking about who might be the best person to talk to that athlete to engage in those conversations. And just finally, this last point maybe links a little bit more to what we discussed last week of denial. So actually, female athletes that have maybe their periods have stopped, and they don't want to discuss that because they're worried of disappointing or not being able to train. So they actually don't engage or kind of deny that that's something that's happening. Ness, do you want to finish up so that I stop waffling on?
God, you're waffling tonight, Nat. Okay, so we're coming to the end of our of the webinar. So hopefully you found them both enjoyable, and you've taken a lot of information away from them that you can use with your athletes. So we just wanted to kind of get you to think about a couple of things. So if we were in a workshop environment, this is kind of what we would do. So have a think about 2 things that you've learned from webinar 1 and webinar 2. And maybe think about 1 action to complete following the webinars on the female athlete. So rather than trying to tackle it as a big whole and moving forward, just think of 1 thing that you can change now to sort of move forward. And then also consider, how are you going to share this information? You know, how are you going to share it with other coaches and with parents and with the athlete? So if you're thinking around Natalie's information there around having those conversations, so how can you go about sharing this information and making those steps to make these conversations normal moving forward? And then again, just how are you going to put this into practice or sort of build on today? So just a couple of key pointers of things to maybe think about moving forward using the female athlete work. Okay.
Perfect, thanks Ness. Yeah, shall we go over, I'm aware that we have already gone on for an hour and I do apologise. Should we maybe kind of take like 5-10 minutes of questions? And like I said, I'll leave it up for just a couple of minutes and then I'll move on to the next slide that's got our emails on. So you can jot those down, and any questions that we don't get a chance to answer tonight, please get in touch with us and we'll get in touch with and we'll respond in, hopefully cover those questions that way.
Oh.
Ness, have you got any question? Can you find the questions? Because oh, here we go.
I can only see one at the moment. So a bit more. So the one I can see, I don't know if you can see this one. So ideally, should training be planned around high intensity first 14 days and longer low intensity training the second 14 days? This would be difficult with group sessions of teenage non-elite athletes. Do you want to answer that, Nat, based on the information you shared?
Yeah, so there's obviously, I shared some information around the use of glycogen at the start and fat fuel for the kind of latter 14 days. But I wouldn't be limited by that. So yes, there is that kind of that shift in utilization of fuel, but you're still able to perform high intensity in the second half, and likewise endurance in the first half. It's just more what might be favoured. So females might just find it a little bit harder to really hit the really high intensity within that second phase. But that's when, as I've discussed, what other strategies can you use to be able to ensure that's still the case? So actually within the second half of that cycle, when you've got more of a fat as fuel, how can you use nutrition? Can you make sure you've just got a snack that allows you to have that immediate energy so that you can hit those high intense sessions? So I think that's why I was explaining that there's not the concrete evidence, and also I don't think we need to go away and completely change how we plan and do specific sessions for a whole group based on a menstrual cycle, but it's looking at, and again, some female athletes might not be affected, or they might be able to equally hit their high intensity at the luteal phase of their cycle as they can in the follicular phase. But maybe those athletes that you can see are maybe getting a bit more sluggish or struggling with the high intensity work, what extra strategies can be put in place that they can still achieve that through nutrition, as I mentioned, is one example.
I can't see any more questions. Have we got any more questions?
Oh, one has just come in. I have put up our email addresses. So if we answer this question and then anyone else can kind of send us through on our emails if they've got any questions. So question that's just come in, I'll read out to you, Ness. If an athlete has been on oral contraception for a long time, can coming off the pill increase risk of injury or have any other negative impacts? So I'll start off and Ness add in anything as and when it fits. So I think the main thing when you're coming off oral contraception is maybe there's not necessarily, and again, I would say the research on this isn't really clear, there's not strong support, but actually just monitor how you're feeling. If you have a cycle that returns that's regular, what symptoms you're experiencing, and then that might be able to give you a bit of a bigger picture of how you are feeling. So for example, I'm happy to share my own experience now that I took contraceptive when I was swimming because it was way easier to manage, but actually I stopped taking that for how it was making me feel. So I was having negative symptoms of like headaches. I was also kind of just felt flat all the time. So then when I stopped taking that, it took me a while to work out just kind of what was normal. And definitely then, and again, the negative impacts where I started getting really bad cramps again. So just, it can have some negative effects regarding the symptoms you experience whilst the hormones balance out. But just, I would say, track those, monitor them, and then hopefully that'll start building a picture so that you're able to manage that and be able to perform at your optimal, really. Anything to add to that, Ness?
No, I think everything you said there is what I would say. But yeah, again, just kind of, as you say, when you come off, it just takes a while for your body to balance out and get your hormones back to level. So yeah, it's just kind of, if you're kind of monitoring that, it's easier to understand how your body's reacting to it.
Perfect. I think we'll wrap it up there. But like I said, please, if you've got any further questions, our emails are there. Please feel free to get in touch. Please, more than happy to answer any more questions. Before I forget, if you can fill out the evaluation form, which will be sent to you following this, that would be brilliant. It's always great to receive feedback, see what aspects of both part 1 and part 2 that you found enjoyable, or what you'd like to find more information about when talking about the female athlete. And as Ness mentioned, I'm going to read this so I don't get the wrong date. The Performance Nutrition team from Sport Wales are delivering a webinar on the 13th of July, which is going to be building a positive nutrition culture in your training environment. So although that's not directly around the menstrual cycle and female health, that could be really, really useful information that support those optimal nutrition choices, which will inevitably link in with the female athlete in the menstrual cycle and ensuring a good, healthy, balanced diet as we've recommended. So thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you've enjoyed part 1 and part 2. And as I said, any further questions, drop Ness or I an email.